Hello and welcome to our third session of today's Interoperability Virtual Day. My name is Matt Rayner. I want to thank each and every one of you again for being a part of this program here today. We are now going to move on to a panel discussion on the future of consumer-facing digital health platforms and apps. I want to thank our friends at LexisNexis Risk Solutions for partnering with us on this panel discussion, bringing these great thought leaders together. And at this time, I'd love to once again bring on to the virtual stage our editor-in-chief, Mark Haglin, to moderate this session. Mark, if you're there, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much to everyone in our audience. We're thrilled to have you here, or as I like to say, to have you here now or in the future. I love greeting people in the future. Anyway, I'm so excited to have this group of panelists with us, Matt Warrens, Jonathan Shannon, and Paul Warburton. This is going to be a really interesting discussion, I can tell you. Let's start by, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to introduce himself, his title and role, and briefly his organization and relation to the subject to us. So why don't we do it in that order? Matt, Jonathan, Paul. Matt, please go ahead. Thank you.
First of all, Mark, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to dig into this topic. But my name is Matt Warrens. I'm the Managing Director of Innovation at Unity Point Health System. Unity Point is headquartered in Iowa. We have a health system footprint across the entire state of Iowa and a small footprint in Wisconsin and Illinois as well. As the Managing Director of Innovation, I oversee our direct investment fund. Our venture fund invests directly in digital health and med device solutions. And I also oversee two other functions in the organization, our accelerator, which we'll talk in more detail today, but essentially what our accelerator does is it takes our innovation portfolio companies and scales them across our organization. And the third function is our incubator, which is our internal function around building a culture of innovation across our organization and helping our clinicians become, we like to say, entrepreneurs. So excited to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. Jonathan, why don't you go next?
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Shannon. I'm a senior director in our strategy group here at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, specifically focused on interoperability in healthcare. Our company offers a variety of data and analytics solutions for healthcare entities to help them understand the dynamics within the healthcare ecosystem and manage their risk and make insightful decisions on behalf of our customers. I also have experience in a variety of roles previous to this in healthcare around value-based care and interoperability. And I'm excited to be here and have a discussion with you about digitization of healthcare. Take care.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Paul Warburton. I am a director of customer insights over here at KLAS. What that basically means is that I handle a lot of our external publications across a myriad of segments, primarily focused on value-based care, population health, patient communications, and acute care EMR, and several other things over the 7 years I've been over here at KLAS. And KLAS is focused primarily with publishing content out to providers on vendor performance, as well as working with vendor organizations on how they can improve to drive excellence with their products and their customers. And yeah, so been working a lot around interoperability recently and did some of the recent work on our provider focus report on information blocking. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, all three of you. It's very exciting. So let me just say for about a minute, a couple of things about what's going on right now out in the industry from my perspective. People have been talking about what would happen when consumer-facing apps became prevalent and became widely adopted in healthcare. Well, now it's starting to happen. And things are a little bit confused out there. We need the insight of all three of you to help us kind of parse what's going on, because as we all know, healthcare was already extremely complex, and every new thing that comes around seems to just add to the complexity. And one of the questions is, how does the data from these apps get integrated into broader digital health initiatives, how we look at the strategic, operational, and security concerns and considerations around these apps and their data, and basically, in a nutshell, what we do with them, right? And so let's ask those questions. Let's find out. But to begin with, let's do this. I would love it, Matt, if you would tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Unity Point, you and your colleagues, including investing in the development of new apps, and tell us a little bit about your approach, because that will give us some grounding in terms of what innovative organizations like yours are actually doing in this area. So go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So, in a couple of weeks here, we'll mark 3 years that we've been at this. And so when I joined the organization in Q4 of 18, we quickly did an assessment to understand that being here in the middle of the country, it's not a likely scenario that we were going to be building and launching a lot of technology. And that was a big one amongst probably several influencers around our decision to launch a venture fund and do direct investing in startups. That way, I guess essentially we had a one-time conversation about buy versus build, we don't have that conversation every time we're going out and looking for a solution for something. We're doing the buy, but because we're investing financially, we don't call these companies vendors. We call them partners. We're working together to not only help develop their core products, but really help them understand how we scale those solutions across a large complex health system like ours. We don't use the P word here. We're not piloting things. We jump right out of the gate and try to understand not only how will this work, say, in one clinic, in one hospital, in one region, but across our entire organization. And then the other thing I would add, another big driving factor behind our strategy and what we're doing is how deep of a dive we've taken in risk. We have well over 30% of the population that we manage is in some risk-based scenario, whether it be shared savings, full risk, ACO, and we're moving a large percentage of that population 1/1 of next year into direct contracting. And so I tell you that to tell you that one of the things that, as much as we look externally for solutions, I'd say equally part of our responsibilities around change management internally, and sort of tie that back to my other comments. Specifically, what I mean is that helping the organization understand, like, we're not the skunk works group, like we're not going out and finding solutions and then trying to find where the problem is in our organization. We look at our health system strategy, and it's not, I don't think it's a secret recipe, right? It's provider experience, patient consumer experience, rev cycle optimization, those types of things. And the thing that our team is always asking itself when we're evaluating solutions is we're looking for things that extend the reach of our providers and make our consumer experience, frictionless wherever possible.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Sorry. So just maybe one detail about how's the execution of how that works. And so I think it's an important detail. So I mentioned our accelerator team earlier. So what our accelerator team does, they have a dedicated set of resources to spend in current fiscal years to execute on scaling those solutions that the venture fund has made investments in. So we have operational budgets to pay SaaS-based software fees. We have staff on that team that have project management experience, nurse informatics backgrounds. So that team doesn't get caught up in all the other stuff going on in a large healthcare system, right? Whether it be M&A activities, Epic upgrades, et cetera. We're constantly turning that wheel in front of operations to say we can help pay for, adopt, and scale these things immediately, and then turn them over to operations in the following fiscal year.
Wonderful, Matt. Very exciting. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to ask Jonathan and Paul, why don't you share your nationwide perspectives on what's going on in this space. If you want to comment on what Matt just shared about what's happening at Unity Point, you're certainly welcome to. But my main question for both of you is, how do you see the nationwide landscape around this? Jonathan and then Paul, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can see a fundamental push towards exposing more data on behalf of a consumer, right? So I've been in healthcare long enough to see consumerism come and go and come and go and come and go. And so this time it seems like it's really sticking. And the reason is ONC and CMS have made a fundamental mandate around putting the patient at the middle of the data exchange, right? So with their final rule in 2022 around interoperability, it really pushes the onus for that ownership of the data to the consumer level. That's never really happened before. I've been in meetings, 10 years ago where we were talking about collaboration between a health plan and a pharmaceutical company. And someone said, well, what about the member? And people just said, well, what about them? They're on the receiving end of the treatment or of our benefits. It doesn't really matter. I think that conversation has shifted now. And now you can see that people are trying to take ownership of their data, and they want a means by which to do that. ONC has been quoted saying that this is something they want to make as easy as financial institutions or travel or what have you, and everyone has a smartphone and they want to be able to pull up the ability to book a doctor, review a doctor, understand their healthcare in the palm of their hand. And that's where we're moving towards. And so I think you see here with interoperability and the data exchange that's been facilitated by the rules that have been set forth, you're going to see a much more informed consumer of healthcare. There is a lot of data still out there that needs to be parsed through, needs to be orchestrated, needs to be developed to provide insights. And there is a lot of complexity on how someone can navigate the healthcare ecosystem. But I think you're starting to see a turning point in the way that a consumer interacts with the healthcare ecosystem.
Absolutely. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump right in there. I definitely think there's, it's interesting. I mean, I 100% agree about forward-looking things that are happening in the industry. When I actually stop and I look at reality, even though we do have things like the CARES Act, and certainly just this last April, the initial information blocking rules came into play. It's still yet to come into play for the vendor side of this, which a lot of the movement providers and the industry needs to happen. It's all on the vendor side. And it's been fascinating. Even some of the payers that are looking at this, they're actually looking at some of those information blocking things and saying, okay, open up my data or pay the fine. I'll pay the fine. And we've heard that from some of those organizations. And it'll be really fascinating to see which of the vendors actually buck up and say, hey, yeah, I'm gonna grab this by the horns. I'm gonna open up all these APIs and give you full access to all this. Because currently, there isn't a really big incentive for the vendors to actually open all that up. Even vendors that have been proactive, for instance, Epic, and built out an app orchard, many of the vendors we talk with tell us, well, oh my gosh, when I get on this app orchard, they're giving me this narrow sliver, right? So what happens to actually blowing this up and giving us that full data? And so I just really struggle with the reality and some of the logistics that providers are dealing with today, saying, oh my gosh, I want to be responsible for this patient's heartbeat that they're measuring through Apple My Health app. I want to be liable for that. Many providers I speak with say, well, hold on, let's actually talk about some of these things. And so you have all this happening in the reality. And then at the same time, we actually see vendors who are stepping up, who are saying, oh my gosh, yes, fire standards are going to be clutch for enabling this. And that's those standards now exist. And certainly we have tons of progress and large EMR vendors opening up and participating in national organizations saying, yes, we're going to give access to this and facilitate. At the end of the day, though, a lot of the provider decisions, their first, and part of this is due to COVID, they first said, okay, before we focus on the complete consumerism, maybe there's a slice of consumerism which is more palatable. And that's first going to be around RPM and doing acute health in the home, right? Where the provider is actually saying, okay, I manage more of this. And I'm willing to stomach more of this as I look at tackling and being more accountable for risk. So those are some very broad thoughts that providers and vendors have shared with me about where we're at in making progress towards the future of the digitization.
I loved all those comments. Thank you so much. One of the things that strikes me about this, and all three of you, please tell me if I'm a total weirdo. Well, I'm a total weirdo, but specifically about this, which is this hits me mentally in an interesting way. It's like some of the discussion around the personal health record, the PHR, which never got a footing in healthcare, even though it was talked about for literally 30 years. And one of the challenges with the PHR was and continues to be, who's actually going to manage it? Like on the ground, who's going to manage it? Physicians and physician groups didn't want to do it. It was too much of a hassle. Some hospitals were willing to do it, but they were like, well, it's still a hassle. Health plans wanted to do it, but plan members didn't trust them enough. Now, one of the things you brought up, Paul, that I think was so interesting is, yeah, we're going to have data that may not be useful clinically, that may not be relevant. Who decides which data is useful and relevant? Who decides where, like literally where to put the data? Like, where do you put it? Do you try to put it into the EHR? Do you try to keep it on servers in data lakes? It's all very unclear. Jonathan, I see you nodding. Tell me your thoughts. I'm kind of all over the place there, so, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of questions. I think Paul very accurately assessed the situation, right, of moving from legacy and current state to where we want to be in the future, whatever you think, like kind of high in the sky. I mean, as far as data orchestration and where you put it and what's useful, I mean, I think that a lot of that will have to come down to understanding what physician's perspective, right? Because it's a liability concern as well as I mean, we can't push every single piece of data to a physician and expect them to make a decision on the fly, right? It's unreasonable. That being said, I think there are some industry groups out there like Karen and Da Vinci who have done phenomenal work pulling together what we call implementation guides around interoperability, and right, what data elements are relevant for specific kinds of data, right? So whether it's CPCDS or the PDEX exchange or the US core data set, those things are being put into FHIR standards, and then those expectations are being set on the industry that this is the way that you exchange data, and this is it's going to be iterative over time, but it's going to be one of those things where I think as we continue to have this dialogue, as we start to see what's working, we can push ahead. Do we start to integrate data around socioeconomic determinants of health above and beyond clinical data? Is it relevant? Is it helpful? I think there's going to be a lot of discussion that's going to happen over the coming years as people start to get more comfortable with ingesting more data, understanding what data is now available, and how it needs to be orchestrated to make it useful. That you're going to see those implementation guides evolve and the data standards evolve as well.
Yeah.
And let me jump in. I'll piggyback right off of that. A lot of the physicians we talk to, and specific to their EMR experience, but it's generally applicable to many situations. And in one instance, we asked them, they say, we are drowning in data from our EMR. And then in the same breath, they say, yet I still cannot find the insights I actually want. I don't want to read through the whole CCDA. And one of the fascinating things for me is I actually look, at all the population health vendors' performance, and what are the key things time and again that comes up between those that are great vendors in that space and those that are mediocre, or some, I won't even say mediocre, good. Let's talk about separating the good from the great. And honestly, it's the vendors that have enough hand-holding and customization with their customers, so they're delivering insights at the point of care, not data at the point of care. And they are deeply embedded with their providers' risk-based agreements, So they actually know, okay, based on your agreements, I know that this data is no longer pertinent, but I know that this person's coming in for this reason. And so here are the few things we're going to flag. And the best providers out there, they have empowered the point of care physicians, the PCPs, by actually giving them resources and breaking up their day and saying, physician, you no longer move 15-minute increments throughout the day. What you're going to do is I'm going to give you, go through the risk assessment. All right, here are our top candidates. And then have someone else actually process some of that data in something like a Health Catalyst or an Arcadia through those dashboards. And then they will present that to the clinician. So clinicians goes into the actual point of care engagement with those action items. And that's a combination of what the provider is doing and the vendor on the back end with the data that really makes it impactful and says, okay, there's a way forward with this interoperability that's making meaningful interoperability.
And I want to completely agree with that. Data has never been a problem in healthcare, right? We've always had tons and tons of data. It's insights and value at the point of care and at the point of decision making that really matters. So I can't agree with you more, Paul.
Exactly.
I agree with Paul also. I just want to go back to make a comment on his most earliest comments, which is the legislation that's been passed in the last couple of years is game changing, right? But I think to Paul's earlier comments, like it's still not enough. If those fines aren't high enough to mean anything, then they have to be meaningful. And if the large EMR vendors are going to be able to make it so expensive for the savvy startup companies to play in their space, and they're going to threaten their IP the way they do, we can't execute on what Paul is describing. Then we have to get this data in order to create what Paul's describing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sorry,
okay.
Just one last thought. As far as one of the things that this is a game changer, like the CARES Act absolutely is. However, and then you look up and you see there are 8 exceptions. And when you look at some of these exceptions, it's like, oh, I'm putting patient privacy at risk. Well, any provider could almost argue that about any time they're sharing EHR data outside of their health system, especially into a third party, which you are not necessarily controlling what data standards they use and the level of security that they have, right? And so because candidly, some of these exceptions provide too much wiggle room, many EMR vendors are going to look right at those exceptions and say, how do we leverage this? They're not going to look at that with the right hat on of saying, okay, how do we in good faith drive sharing forward? Because it's a law, naturally we jump to that risk mindset of, okay, how do I navigate this with the least possible impact? Just because for some reason, that's just how our hats change when we're dealing with government regulations versus just broad industry challenges, right?
Yeah, just to address, sorry, I keep cutting you off, Mark. One thing about that, I completely agree with Matt's point around enforcement will be key to make these regulations work. And to Paul's point around the exceptions, I think ONC has done a pretty good job establishing the protocol under which you can release data on behalf of the consumer consent with the Smart on Fire protocol. And there will be, proof is in the pudding, right? With government regulations, is a lot of those things where will they enforce HIPAA fines and regulate and regulation associated with data that is now flowing out under that Smart on Fire workflow. The initial thoughts that we have is no, because it's part of what the whole point of the 21st Century Cures Act was meant to do. But there are a lot of concerns around security and identity resolution around Smart on Fire, and I think that they will be addressed as this becomes a little bit more normal over time, and people feel a little more comfortable about the identity resolution on the part of whomever is orchestrating the data. They're 2 Jonathan Shannons because they came in through 2 different means, or I joined a health plan in 2007 and now I joined in 2021 again. Am I the same person, right? So which data do you release? Do you release both? Do you have the capability internally to do that? Do you even know they're the same person, or am I just, 2 different entities within your system? And so there's a lot of things to work through, and I think there's a lot of challenges, but hopefully the Smart on Fire will help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to your comment, Jonathan, we at a session that we had in person a couple of years ago in Los Angeles, we had someone during the Q&A, and we were discussing that very topic of patient ID and identification. And one audience member stood up and said, well, I'm with a health plan here in Southern California, and our health plan has 300 Maria Garcias in our plan, like of one name, Maria Garcia. And so, yes, that's going to be a huge thing. I want to get to the policy issues even more, but let me just back up 1 second. Matt, I'd love to have your thoughts on who manages this data inside a health system, right? And I mean that in a literal sense, like who? Is it, do all these data streams flow into an enterprise-wide data warehouse, and then someone kind of curates the data? Or like on a really basic level, this is triggering thoughts in me that include the question who. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think maybe I would start out, and I agree with Paul's comments. It sounds like he's been talking to a lot of providers, and they're voicing their, I won't put words in your mouth, but somewhat frustration with this. And I think what's hard for the providers to maybe, providers, I don't mean this to sound offensive. I think this is a good thing. Providers want their patients to be their patients, right? And just their patients.
Yep.
But I think the reality is, and that's worked okay up until now, because health systems for the most part are taking care of like this part of a patient's healthcare journey. But as we take on more and more risk, we're now involved in their whole journey. And we have to help our providers understand and agree, I can't manage that whole thing. So I need your help. So now it's not just, Mark bringing, now we have access to all this data and figuring out where we put it. It's how do we build the people and the team around that are going to be receiving that data to help care for that patient on a continuum.
Absolutely. And so the who question is complex, right? To answer.
And I'll even weigh in on that who question, on that the who question, because when I talk to organizations, many organizations still tend to be very siloed in their enterprise data analytics approaches. Meaning, I see this when how many different vendors they have that all do risk scoring, right, in their health system. And some of that's warranted, no doubt, because there's nuances and complexity, but some of it flat out isn't. And it really comes down to, have we taken the effort as a provider organization to, instead of just focusing on certain use cases, building a comprehensive enterprise strategy with our data that can actually tackle a myriad, as many use cases as we can, to first address your value-based reimbursement needs, because that's where money is, and you need to own that upfront and make sure that's successful, because that is where we're transitioning, right? And then B, you start tacking in on all the other care management, social determinant of health, and those types of use cases where you need that data, right, to drive insights, period. And time and time again, I'm talking to One Health, even small organizations, and they'll deploy, we do have Health Catalyst, but we're only using it for this niche, and we're looking at reimbursement things. And then all of a sudden they're bringing in, we've got a population health and then a services firm, which is doing managed services on our care management, and it becomes very difficult to make enterprise strategic decisions when you have developed and made significant IT purchases in a very use case driven way.
Right, exactly. So all of you kind of address this in a certain way, but let me go explicitly into 21st Century Cures. How do you think 21st Century Cures Act will change this landscape? What do you think how do you think policy shifts will change what we're talking about right now in the next couple of years? Who would like to just leap in? Paul, I
Well, I'm
think
very excited about it, so I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
Great, great.
I mean, I think it will fundamentally change it. I mean, as I alluded to earlier, I think it will fundamentally change it, right? Because now we're getting, Paul touched on this as well. There are a lot of incumbents who hold data today, right? It has been their data, right? If it sits in their system, it's their data. 21st Century Cures Act kind of turns that on its head. It's not their data anymore. It's the patient's data. It's the consumer's data. They have, if they have data on me and I want it, give it to me. And that's the way that the regulation is written. I get the right to pull my data out of your system and bring it to whomever I want. And I can share it with, if I want to share it with Google or Facebook because I want more targeted ads.
Yep.
If I want to share it with Best Buy so they can help me choose a better scale to measure my weight so I can manage my CHF. If I want to share it with my providers, if I want to share it with my with a good RX so I can get discounts on drugs, I have the right to do that, and that's my prerogative. And there's a system in place by which that this data is a standardized format, and people know what they're going to be getting. Now, that being said, that's a very altruistic, very excited view on it. No consumer has the ability to do that on their own, right? No one's going to go and write to these APIs and say, please, I'm going to download a JSON file from provide a patient access API at Humana or Aetna or whatever it may be as of July 1st, 2021. They'll need help. They'll need app developers to do that on their behalf. They'll need partners and they'll need people that they can trust. And I saw this question come up around, security and privacy. There's going to be a lot of people out there who want this data, and people have to be very, very rigorous around what it is that as an app that you can actually trust. That's not going to use this data for malicious purposes. And then also on the flip side, the other thing that was going to have to happen is enforcement of these rules is going to have to happen, right? Because I think it was Paul who talked about this. If people are just going to take the fine and not publish an API, that's up to them from a business perspective. But we have to make sure that the government, we will have to see whether the government is willing to back up the words that they're putting out there. The thing that gives me a lot of hope in that regard is the 21st Century Cures Act was published in the last couple months of the Obama administration. It was developed pretty heavily under the Trump administration and is now being rolled out under the Biden administration. If those three administrations can agree on something, that's amazing. So I think that if you're seeing the general consensus that this is the right place to go. I mean, this act was passed with 95% Senate approval. I think this is going to get some traction under it and some enforcement behind it, unless we completely miss the vote.
Yeah.
I 100% agree. And I also agree that honestly, the most optimistic things is that you really have to take the last 10 years and see how we've been moving. And well, no, things are absolutely changing. And what I would liken, my optimism with the CARES Act going forward is probably going to move in direct correlation with the adoption of FHIR APIs by the different vendors. And of course, with providers involved and everything. Because I really see that as the same thing as like EMR adoption was tied to meaningful use, right? Those two things were hand in hand, right? And these FHIR APIs are going to be absolutely essential to making the behind the scenes feel like, okay, this is actually possible. Addressing all the care handoffs and transitions of care into post-acute, this is now possible. Let's do it. Rather than saying, again, your reality when you're moving to post-acute is, hey, let's send the e-fax. Oh my goodness, I don't know anybody who has a fax number anymore. And yet post-acute transitions still happen in that place. And so once we have the behind the scenes capabilities, everyone's going to feel so much more confident doing all the other pieces and actually saying, okay, I have the right desires. Yes, I want it to be out there, and the logistical capabilities are now there. Boom, it's just going to happen, and the legislation is now, it exists.
Yeah. So,
Matt, your thought? Oh, no,
yeah.
Go ahead.
There's so much to be excited about here. Picking up on one of Paul's earlier comments. These data warehouse, the analytic tools, the population health solutions. Those we need those things, but at the end of the day, all they really do is surface issues, right? They don't do anything. They don't solve a problem, and in most cases, it's all retrospective, right? I mean, what the data coming in on claims is 6 months behind. So anything we can try to do to help a patient, we're already 6 months behind on. This act is going to accelerate that data to come through in real time, and then let us create insights to tee up to the consumers. Hey, we know this about you because you trusted us with this data. And by the way, here's 3 things you can do to address this, and give them choices and let them, we talked about the physician burden earlier. There are a lot more things we can do to provide consumers and patients things to take action on their own. And this is going to be a big driver behind that.
Yeah. So let me ask, when functionally, Jonathan, you made a great comment about virtually no consumers are going to write emails to API developers, right? Like, dear, it's just not going to happen. When will consumers functionally control even some of their data? And that might sound like a facetious question, but it's a real question. Seema Verma, when she announced the transparency rule 2.5, nearly 3 years ago at HIMSS, 3 years ago, February, she made a huge deal about, we're going to empower consumers, we're going to empower consumers, we're going to empower consumers. Yet the reality is that we all know 99.99% of consumers in US healthcare could not actually manage, in the real sense, streams of data, right? Like I certainly couldn't, I'm going to be a data manager. I don't think so. So what does consumer empowerment look like? When is it going to happen? And how is it going to happen?
Well, this involves crystal ball. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Paul, what did you say?
It totally is the crystal ball, though. However, I think there are some very promising things that happened as a result of COVID. And even though RPM is not a patient-facing app, honestly, the innovations that are coming in that space, those are all your precursors. Because one of the big challenges with patient-facing apps, especially in healthcare, if you think about all the other things, apps that people waste a ton of their time on, it's all because they can more or less exploit a natural human flaw. Either your laziness, you're entertained by it, or something like that. There are these mind-sucking consumer-based applications, or you're making purchases, which people get that dopamine hit. Getting preached to by an app about my health sounds like having to go to my dentist appointment every day instead of just twice a year. It's much more challenging to expose that natural human tendency and say, let's hit smoking cessation. This is going to help you a ton here. And people really don't like to be preached to. So there's a big barrier that still exists there, even when you say, oh, we'll get Facebook and Apple and Google, who are these wonderful consumer things. Just throwing them at human nature doesn't solve human nature. However, when I look at some of the great gains in RPM and doing acute health at home, all of a sudden I see things like infusions, home infusions being done more frequently, and just really dropping down that cost of care. And all of a sudden, that's a huge win for health systems and for providers that provider organizations can own today. And then you see organizations like Tyto, who will actually send the patient, a box of certain things, put it down your throat, measure things. I mean, it's not EHI because I think today with Tyto, you still actually email the results back to the provider organization. But all of these types of things are very relevant, pertinent data feeds that will turn into real-time data feeds, especially through the adoption and some of these things here, which are huge game changers, which are going to drop your cost of care for providers and really move us forward and make significant steps, even before we have to solve this human nature challenge of getting me to eat less greasy food.
I don't want to get us too far off track, but I want to make a real world example of what Paul just described. So I would tell you that 2.5 years ago, well, first of all, I would tell you that in healthcare, we only design one way to do anything, right? We just think this will work best for us. So this is how we're going to do whatever it is we're doing. So 2.5 years ago, take RPM, for example, we just said, oh, this is the RPM solution we're going to use. And we just threw it at the entire population. We made one way that they would enroll. We made one way that we would create interventions for the patients that needed it. Now we're getting smart enough to say, no, now we have consumer insights on these patients. And we know that, hey, this 35% of the patients, they're digitally savvy. We can just text them this and they will voluntarily fall into this. Hey, this 20% of these patients, they are probably only going to take an action on this if during a PCP visit, their provider comes in and sits down and talks to them about the benefit of this, and then they're going to do it. And oh, hey, by the way, this 20% of the population, they're never going to do this, right? Okay, yep. What are we going to do about that population now? And so I think that's a real world thing that has happened here in our program around what Paul was describing.
Yeah, Matt, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I would even say perhaps, it's hard to say, but perhaps a majority of patients as healthcare consumers will never get really actively involved in managing data that they technically own. In any case, a very large plurality. So I think that's really important.
I think
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think that's the case with any data set, right? I mean, you're going to have different varying levels of sophistication across the board. And I think Paul and Matt hit on this already. I mean, you have to have a discrete value proposition for a consumer to engage with an app to ingest data and provide them insights and provide them action items, right? You can't just be like, here's a data dump, unless you're clinically savvy and go through all of the various outcomes. I mean, I think of something as simple as, when I get my lab test results from my provider, I mean, I wait for my provider to reach out and tell me, hey, your cholesterol is a little elevated, your blood pressure is a little elevated, maybe you should eat some more greens and do some exercise. Those kind of things are the what this data enables, but you'll need a someone acting on your behalf to provide you the insights, because I don't think any consumer is going to fundamentally gain value from a pure interoperability data dump. However, as I do with everything, I'm very optimistic about the future. And I think this is something similar to what you saw in the financial world, right? And I know this is different, but there's parallels to be drawn here, right? Back in the 80s and 90s, would you have ever thought that a person could trade stocks on their own on a platform? Absolutely not. I mean, that's something that a broker do. You called them in, you said, what would your advice be? I don't know what to invest in. You talk about a PE ratio for a stock. Someone's like, people, I have no idea what that means. Now you have E-Trade, Schwab, you have all of these platforms that people actively engage in. You have the retail investor who is enabled via data and education in this new world of data. And so I think what you will see is it's definitely not happening in 2021 and 2022. But as you have more and more access to data as a consumer, you'll see an increased engagement of the consumer in their decision-making process. And then you'll also see an increased understanding of what the ecosystem looks like. Oh, I had this outcome. I need to go do this because of the things the data that I have available at my fingertips.
I agree. Go ahead.
I just want to piggyback off that, because really what I see now really getting pie into the sky is once we couple that data with clinical decision support tools in a patient-facing generated app, that's your next iteration of telehealth. Because even today, for a certain demographic, they still don't even want to get on and have a voice conversation with a nurse or other clinician, right? If they actually had the right tools and the right savvy, and there was a way to link those up, again, there's so many things I'm sure people are thinking that is so not safe, but I mean, that's honestly when all of a sudden you actually can start really getting patient facing apps taking a load off providers, right? For certain things.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, Mark, I was just going to maybe tell a little bit about the platform that we're launching here, how we're doing what Paul's describing. So we're before the year is over, we're launching a platform called BeWell that does exactly what we've been talking about. It brokers those APIs on behalf of the consumer. And there's a ton of things I like about it, but one of the things I like the most about it is that when the consumer onboards on the platform, the very first thing they're doing is it's very transparent about what they're consenting to do and how much they're consenting to do. And they have the choice to say, I want to share with UnityPoint not only my health plan, I go to Walgreens for pharmacy, I have this secondary insurance. I'm a snowbird, so I go to Banner and Phoenix in the winter, and I now can pull that EHR data into that platform as well. So, you know, for the consumer, it's providing that trusted source. It's my opinion, like the reason that we're moving so quickly here at Unity Point to launch this is because I think that traditionally most health systems have looked at these regulations and said, oh, I have to comply with these things. Or in my words, they're playing defense. And my prediction is that the payers are going to use these new regulations to play offense. And all this is at the end of the day is a race to see who is going to own the consumer at the end of the day. And I believe, as and some of you said this earlier in the discussion, who does a consumer trust more, their healthcare provider or their payer? Well, it's their healthcare provider. And so here we're taking the initiative to get out in front and provide this platform to these consumers to broker these APIs. Yes, there's a big benefit in this for us as well, because then now we're getting those real-time consumer insights so that we can be teeing up to those patients. Hey, we think based on what we know about you, you would be interested in this, or we have this program we can offer you.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Well,
Thanks, Matt, for blowing my mind. I wanted to be on this call so I could have my mind blown today, and you just did it. So I appreciate it. That's awesome.
good, good. Well, we have never had such an engaged audience as now. If you guys look at the chat, that we've got about 15 comments. So let me kind of curate these, because we are at the point, we have 14 minutes left. We're not even going to be able to answer all the questions. So I'm going to pick and choose, and I apologize to those who won't be chosen, but we won't even be able to get to everything. I will read one comment. One audience member says, one of the legitimate concerns for full access to data is the complexity of identity, authorization, and role, and they include self, parent, child, caregivers. I completely agree with that. The same audience member says, I thought the session would be more patient or consumer focused. Sounds very provider centric. Then we have this comment. To Jonathan's comment, comparison to financial and travel industries, patient-physician relationship is much more personal in nature, selection not just dollar financially focused, and has many underlying prerequisites, suggests delivering an equivalent open selection landscape for health to be back burner for now and focus on improving trust by clinicians of patient source data, which is achievable. So those are a couple of, another comment, actually most of these are comments, so I'll just read them quickly. Another comment, well, one person just writes national patient ID. Another audience member writes, we want our patients to be healthy and satisfied, and we want them to be able to get into CS when they need to. Another comment, tech and apps for consumer engagement. If MDs express trust in the patient as a data partner, they will engage. Here's an interesting question written as a comment. It was just announced that CMS is proposing elimination of the Medicare coverage of Innovation Technology, MCIT program. This program was designed to speed up Medicare coverage for mHealth technology classified as breakthrough medical devices by the FDA. It would appear the impact of this decision will stifle connected health innovation. The panel's thoughts. Any quick thoughts on that? Oh, Jonathan, I think that you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, something happened.
I was saying, I'm afraid I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I think that's a broader policy discussion around innovation. Obviously, money is what motivates a lot of innovation, but I don't think I could answer that one fully.
Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
Honestly, that was a really long comment. And most of it went over my head.
Well, I think what they're saying essentially is it seems like a step backwards that this MCIT program was eliminated, and I haven't had a chance to read it myself. So anyway, we'll take it.
Yeah,
for what it's
I'm not familiar with the MCIT to even just gesticulate, you know, what the implications would be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Is any work being done on providers being able to see what the payer will cover before Patient.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, gentlemen.
Go ahead, Paul.
Go you. Oh, sorry. I responded before the very last part. As far as like preemptive requirements, yes, there certainly are. Where I thought it was going is just being able to see some of this data about patients before, and actually, this is actually public information in a report we put out, so I can say this. Epic is actually making some pretty big inroads with several large payers building integrations and interfaces with a lot of their claims data up front. And they have some initial alpha partners. One of them is Oshner, who's working with them so that they can actually get, hopefully not 6 months lagging data, but more real time to actually speed up and make that more relevant as people obviously are trying to prognosticate things. But Jonathan, you can jump on and hit that latter part.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as part of the interoperability rule, one of the things that is going to be built upon these patient access APIs above clinical and demographic and claims information, and one of the things that is going to be available to be able to be pulled down is prior authorization. And so there is this idea that you can see and what the burden will be associated with course of treatment. And so in 2023, there should be the ability to understand, be able to call a FHIR-based API and get that information in the matter of minutes.
Okay, great. Well, we just have enough time. Here's what I'd love to do. I'd love for each of you to kind of summarize this moment as you see it and predict what will happen in the next few years going forward. And the order doesn't matter. Who would like to begin?
I think for me, I kind of talked about some of this earlier in that, with this platform that we're launching called BeWell, where the consumer is going to be able to pull all of their data into one place. I mean, I know we say today that the patient owns their medical record, but do they really? I mean, we make it impossible for them to get. And this changes that. And this platform then makes it portable for them. That's the thing I'm most looking forward to. Okay,
great. And what do you think how do you think this landscape will evolve forward in the next few years?
Well, we touched on some of this earlier. I mean, there's still more to be done on these regulations, right? This is a great start, and you're seeing the market, both payers, providers, startups, start to react to it. But there's going to be things that we uncover that we're going to have to push the legislation even further.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always enjoy the crystal ball questions there. It's like, where's the market going to go? I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit. I think you're going to see increased consumerism in this space because of the data, right? Because there's going to be a lot more people entering, trying to be part of that relationship with the patient and the consumer, and really help derive those insights that Paul alluded to earlier, which as opposed to just being a means for pushing data into the world. I think you're going to have people act as an intermediary to kind of orchestrate and standardize and normalize the data and provide insights on behalf of the consumer. And then I think you're going to see the consumers become more educated about where they're going. I think a lot of people choose their doctor because they're the doctor down the street, and their health plan because it's the health plan that pops up first on the Google search. I think that this data is going to fundamentally change the way that people ingest that data, and the people who will help them make those decisions will also evolve.
That makes sense. Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback right off that and really just say you're going to see a continued bifurcation along providers that lean heavily into that and those that don't. And those organizations that do, they're going to be the ones that will gain more of the customer market share in their respective markets, because they have connected the journey of care for that patient with things that are at home, obviously the inpatient, with post-acute, and then back home with a PCP/care manager throughout this entire journey. And that, man, it is going to be extremely difficult for smaller hospitals to exist in the future, even harder than it is today. There is not things I'm seeing, really anything in the legislation in value-based reimbursement and in in the technology world that says, oh my gosh, it's easy to be a rural critical access hospital. Honestly, even in the world of PCPs, partnerships will be more critical because the expectation that you're going to take on risk is continuing to come. Now, what I really anticipate this rolling out is the same thing that we've seen with value-based reimbursement. We have innovators, we have the middle space, we have toe dippers, and then extreme laggers that just are waving that fee-for-service flag until it goes down, right? And I think you're going to see the exact same thing here. That's why it's not necessarily even a 5-year journey, but more the 10-year journey of this, of all the full implications of the legislation happening today coming to pass.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I'll just add a couple of comments. First of all, you've all given us tremendous insights here. I really appreciate it. I think that it's going to be a messy next few years, because not necessarily bad messy, sometimes good messy, but we're going to have to kind of figure out how we govern these processes, right? Once patient care organizations start ingesting consumer data from consumer-facing apps, they're going to have to figure out what to do with it in the literal sense, what to do with it. Like, do you try to enter some of it into the EHR? If you do, who decides what the protocols are? And again, to go back to the PHR problem, who decides if there are errors in that data? You know, one of the underlying reasons why the PHR has stumbled so much in the last 30 years in its existence is, what if the patient says something, writes something into their PHR that is simply factually incorrect, which is very possible. Who monitors that? Who manages that? And some of the data may not be translating correctly. You know, it might go into an EDW or wherever it's being put into and not really be usable. So I think it's going to be kind of messy. I think that I agree with all of you. There are going to be organizations that are going to kind of take the bull by the horns and say, this is what we're going to do. And some of them will actually create market advantage for themselves by doing so. But I also agree with whoever said, you know, we're never going to have all, quote unquote, all healthcare consumers engaged actively in their data. And many won't be engaged in apps to begin with. So I think there are several segments of this, and they're going to kind of move forward at kind of different paces, if that makes sense. Does anyone else have any additional comments? And then I'll just close off.
Not for me.
I think you summed it up pretty well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, you gentlemen have all been so incredibly insightful. I know I've learned a lot. I know that our audience has. And I think one of the reasons why, and someone just wrote the comment, health brokers are coming up. Okay. So, and one of the reasons why our audience has been so tremendously engaged is this is a very engaging subject. There's so many elements to it, and all three of you are involved in it and have given us great insights. So I want to thank you all very much for this great session. It's been really, I've learned a lot, and it's been helpful to all of us. So thank you again. And Matt Rayner has returned to thank us all.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Thank you, panelists. An absolutely excellent panel discussion for this interoperability virtual day. Our final session for today's program is going to be taking place here at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. So feel free to stretch those legs, reply to a couple of emails. That final discussion will be a conversation on how FHIR, as in FHIR, is the way forward. So we will see you back here at 3:30, and we're looking forward to that final discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.